now invite onto the dais Chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Dr. Bibek Debroy, to please join us for a special address. Dr. Bibek Debroy.
Honorable Justice Manmohan, Mr. Garg, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by thanking TIOL Tax Congress for having invited me here. As has already been announced, I have an official hat. But Mr. Garg has set the template for 2047. So therefore, anything that I say should not be interpreted as indicative of what the Economic Advisory Council has recommended to the Prime Minister or as indicative of what is likely to happen in the forthcoming budget. These are my comments as a citizen and my comments as an economist. Let's start with the big picture. And what is the big picture? The big picture is, as citizens, all of us expect government to deliver various public goods and services. I'm not using the word public goods and services, the expression public goods and services in the sense in which an economist uses it, which is a very specific sense. I'm using the expression public goods and services in the sense that these are things that we expect the government to deliver, perhaps even provide, perhaps even subsidize, because the private sector is not going to do that. And we will have a long list if we go around this room of what the government should be doing. It will be physical infrastructure, roads, railways, other forms of transport. It will be social infrastructure, health, education. There is a completely different question not linked to this Congress, but I will just mention it. There are issues of the level of government that delivers these public goods and services. Because most public goods and services that are not delivered by union government, they are not even delivered by state governments, they are delivered by local governments. So there's an issue of decentralization and fiscal devolution, which is not just union government, it is also within states, from the state governments to local bodies. But leave that aside. All of us as citizens would like to see railway stations like the ones we see abroad, airports like the ones we see abroad. But to deliver these, the government needs the resources. And the primary source of resources for governments is taxes. Let's just add up the various demands we have as citizens. Oh, the government, when I say government, I mean governments in all of its three layers. Oh, the government must spend 6% on education as a percentage of GDP. It must spend 4% on health, 6 plus 4, 10%. It must spend 10% on infrastructure, 10 plus 10, 20%. It must spend 3% on defense, 20 plus 3, 23. We are already at 23% of GDP. Today, the tax collection, union and state combined as a percentage of GDP is just around 15%. So the government has a kitty of 15%. Our demands are 23%. So obviously something has to give. When we are talking about taxes, we are either talking about direct taxes or we are talking about indirect taxes. Let's look at both of these individually. First, the GST. The GST has been phenomenal work in progress. It is a remarkable instance of union government and state governments working together. When the GST was first announced, there was an estimate that floated around, and that estimate said that GST would lead to 1.5% to 2% increment to GDP growth. It was widely quoted. What was not widely quoted was that estimate done by an organization known as the National Council for Applied Economic Research, NCAR, was based on the premise that all goods and services would be part of GST. All goods and services would be part of GST, and there would be a single GST rate. I need not belabor the point about all goods and services not yet being part of GST. Mr. Garg has already mentioned one of those items. But as a polity, we need to take a call on whether we accept there should be a single GST rate or not. Everyone's mindset is one of trying to control and influence. So we decide this particular item is elitist in nature, so the GST rate on this must be higher. This particular item is an item of mass consumption, and therefore the GST rate on that should be lower. The moment we accept this mindset, we allow for differentiation. The moment we allow for differentiation, we allow for subjective interpretation. We allow for litigation. And it is therefore my submission before you that as a polity, we need to recognize that the GST rate should be the same regardless of the product. If progressivity is to be introduced, that is best done through direct taxes, not GST, not indirect taxes. I'm sure several of you have traveled in Europe. And you may have noticed, in some countries in Europe, you may have noticed that the frontage of houses is very narrow. The back is fairly wide. So that if you are going to lug up furniture onto a higher floor, it has to be done through the windows. Now, why is that? Because at some point in history, it was decided that the frontage of a house captured how rich a person was. And therefore, the tax was linked to the area in the front. And naturally, people did what they would always do. They bypassed it. You will notice, particularly in Britain, some of the old houses are very dark. The reason they are dark is at one point in time, windows used to be made out of glass. And it was perceived that glass was an item of elitist consumption. So there was a tax on glass. You did not want to use glass. And therefore, you had smaller windows. But let me not digress too much. On GST, it is my submission, therefore, there should be a single rate. I don't think we'll ever get it, but my submission is that is what we should want. The tendency of every person is to say, remove exemptions, but remove exemptions for everyone else. Please retain exemptions from me. That way, tax simplification does not. When GST was introduced, there were some estimations that were done by the Department of Economic Affairs, and those established that the revenue neutral GST rate, the average rate that would give us the same revenue as pre-GST, that revenue neutral GST rate was at least 17%, if not more. What is the average GST rate today? It's 11.5% or even lower. So on GST, the simple point, reinforcing the broader point that I made, we must be willing to pay higher taxes. Or we must be willing to settle for reduced delivery of public goods and services. Every year, the budget papers have a statement known as revenue foregone. This is revenue that government gives up because of exemptions. Depending on the year, it amounts to 5 to 5.5% of GDP. So the moot question is, should those exemptions at all be there? Let me now quickly come to the question of direct taxation. A lot of improvements have happened. The number of people who submit tax returns has gone up dramatically, as all of you know. The number of people who submit tax returns has gone up dramatically. Does that necessarily mean that all these people who submit tax returns are actually paying taxes? Not necessarily. There is the difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance. Of course, there is tax evasion, and there's been a clamping down on tax evasion. Tax evasion is illegal. Tax avoidance is when you use exemption clauses that exist to reduce taxes. And tax avoidance is perfectly legitimate. The moot question that therefore arises, reiterating a point that I made earlier, is do we need these tax exemptions? The more tax exemptions I have, the more complicated it becomes. The more I need a CA, the more I need a lawyer, the more there is litigation. Why can't we have a simple tax structure devoid of all exemptions? Yes, today, both on the personal income tax side and on the corporate tax side, there is a scheme, not mandatory, of opting for an exemption-less regime. In my view, not an official EACPM view, in my view, this is like jumping a ditch. You cannot jump a little bit of the ditch and hope to jump the rest of the ditch later. We must at some point agree we will move to a completely exemption-less system. If we move to a completely exemption-less system, it is right to ask, why do we have this artificial difference? Mr. Garg said something similar. I'm making a slightly different point. Why do we have this artificial difference between corporate taxes and personal income taxes? a lot of business, unincorporated business, pays taxes under the personal income tax route. If we do this, I think we will also reduce the administrative costs of compliance. I have not made some points because of paucity of time, obvious points about the nature of appeals, about the unnecessary litigation that departments indulge in. But if we are looking to 2047, in terms of transparency, this is what I think we should be looking towards: a completely simplified, unified, harmonized, streamlined direct and indirect tax regime. Thank you very much.